Okay, I'm sure most of you recognize this species on this slide here. Kudzu. But kudzu is just the tip of the iceberg as far as invasive species in the southeast. In fact, we have over 500 non-native species. 384 different invasive plants, 72 vertebrates, 92 invertebrates, insects and the like, and 16 pathogens. So it's a significant problem. I'll just be focusing on the plants today. A non-native plant is one that was introduced on purpose or accidentally through human activity. Now, I'm not here to badmouth all non-native plants. A lot of them are very important to our economy for agriculture and ornamental plants. But about 1 in 10 will escape and start living on its own. About 1 in 10 of those will become naturalized, and about 1 in 10 of those will come as invasive as kudzu. And you're probably doing the math. It's like, well, that's not very much at all. Why are you concerned? It's because we have thousands upon thousands of non-native plants have been brought in and continue to be brought into the country each year. So the Alabama Invasive Plant Council has ranked and listed invasive plants. I've got copies of these out there for you if you're interested. We've ranked, instead of just making a simple list, we've actually ranked plants within 8 different land use categories to show where they're having an impact. A lot of different stakeholders are impacted by invasive plants. We didn't want to paint with a broad brush. It also indicates whether they're still used as an ornamental with that O, or some are still used as crop plants. Now 50% of the plants on that list are escaped ornamentals. You probably recognize a lot of these perhaps from your own yard. I'll talk more about them in a bit. A lot of them, unfortunately, are still being used for wildlife plantings. I know Pat talked earlier about the sawtooth oak. More and more evidence of that becoming invasive. We have autumn olive, shrubby lespedeza, and the multiflora rose, all once used and sometimes still being used for wildlife plantings. Then we're still used quite a bit for forage and soil stabilization. So then why are some species so invasive? And unfortunately there isn't a real simple answer. It depends a lot on the species and the situation. And it's extremely difficult to predict which plants are going to become invasive. So when we have new plants being brought in, unfortunately it's hard to say, well, this one's going to be invasive, don't use it. But we do have characteristics that are commonly seen in invasive plants. They tend to be very competitive. The Kogon grass here, they grow very densely, use up most of the growing space, they shade out other plants, they use a lot of water and nutrients. Very strong reproductive pressure, a lot of seeds, produce seeds earlier, and a lot of them grow vegetatively. You know what happens when you cut down one privet and you don't treat with herbicide? You end up with 6. A lot also will spread just by a small piece of a plant segment, floating downstream and starting a new plant. Very tolerant and adaptive. A lot of these plants, like the thorny olive that is shown here, can grow in sun, they can grow in shade, drought, flooding, saline water. Very adaptive to different situations. Very rapid response to disturbance. They're very opportunistic. If the seeds are around and you create a growing space for it, disturb the soil, they're often the first ones to come in and get established. Release from natural enemies. So these plants have been brought here from somewhere else, but when they came over, the insects and herbivores, other pathogens that would keep the population in check were not brought along with them. And then also in some cases we have hybrid vigor, and I've got a picture here of Chinese wisteria, which I'm sure most of you recognize. Turns out that the wisteria that you see growing alongside the road in the springtime isn't actually Chinese wisteria. It's a hybrid of Chinese and Japanese wisteria. Turns out both the Chinese and the Japanese are fairly well behaved on their own. It's just after they hybridized that it became highly aggressive and invasive. Another characteristic that we have with invasive plants is what we refer to as the lag phase. So here we have time on the x-axis and acres infested or population size. And so here we have the initial introduction. And this is the lag phase. This can last anywhere from a couple years to a couple decades, sometimes 100 years, where the population stays relatively low. It's out there a little bit in the background, but no one is aware of it. It's not invasive. It's not a problem. But then you have this rapid expansion phase where it just takes off. Eventually it will reach biological potential and level off. And this is scale dependent. This could be just talking about my backyard, could be talking about a county or the state. Usually, initial detection that you have a problem with the species doesn't occur until way out here. And that's in people like me who spend all our time dealing with invasive plants. And the general public usually doesn't begin to become aware of the problem until way up here. And the reason that's a problem is because in terms of control, obviously, if you can control it by here, you have a good chance of eradicating it and completely getting rid of the problem. But as you get a larger and larger population, it's going to be harder and harder to control. You definitely aren't going to eradicate a species once it gets up here in this part of the curve. Once you're up here, you're only looking at controlling the plant within special habitats. So the earlier we can detect a species and begin to control it and manage it, the better off we are. So another part of the picture is that there has to be a plentiful supply of propagules. These are coming, as I mentioned, from ornamental plants, wildlife plantings, roadside stabilization, and with increased globalization and world trade, there's more and more opportunities for accidental introduction. And then once they're here, they're moved around in mulch and pine straw and soil. Runoff and floodwater moves it, and then we move it when we're out in the woods with our vehicles, equipment, getting on our shoes and clothing and the pets. So the bottom line then is if you have a plant with invasive tendencies, have abundant propagules, and you add a little disturbance in there to give it a good chance to get established, you're going to end up with situations like this. I don't know if you can see from back there, recognize that species. It blooms in the spring. Everybody recognize it? That's Bradford pear, which is becoming more and more of a problem. This one you probably do recognize, just the big green mess alongside all the roads in the state. Privet. So that's a big mess of privet. This is English ivy in a park, big problem in urban areas. And this one, I know there's no way you can recognize that from there, but that is Chinese tallow tree. Probably our greatest concern as far as woody plants next to privet now in the state. We do have some data, recent data from the U.S. Forest Service, the Forest Inventory Analysis data. These are samples taken just within forested lands in the southeast. This data is just for Alabama. And this is estimate of acres covered by these species. So we have almost 3 million acres of Japanese honeysuckle. Do any of you know how many acres of forest land we have in the state of Alabama? Gary, you should know that too. We have a little over 22 million acres. So then we have nearly 1 million acres is in privet. And then you go on down, it adds up to over 4 million acres of our forest land is occupied by invasive plants. So if you do the math real quick, that's nearly a fifth of our forest land. It's not just a fifth of our forest land has invasive plants on them, but a fifth of it is occupied by invasive plants. Japanese honeysuckle, while we do have 3 million acres of it, since this is a wildlife workshop, most of you probably aware how much deer like to eat Japanese honeysuckle. If we did not have a lot of deer, if something happened to the deer, Japanese honeysuckle would liable just take off and become a huge problem. Right now it's mostly a background plant. You rarely have situations where the honeysuckle is really impeding forest regeneration or, dense infestation. If the deer weren't around, it probably would become a big problem. And kudzu, you're probably thinking, well, there's a lot more kudzu than that in the state. But kudzu is more of an edge plant. It's not a forest interior species. But yeah, tallow tree is definitely on the increase. Okay, so why are we worried about invasive plants? They have a lot of impacts on the ecosystem. One of the largest is on native biodiversity. It's estimated next to habitat loss, invasive plants have the greatest impact on threatened and endangered species. So they obviously are displacing native plants, and the insects and fauna that depend on the native plants are also greatly impacted. Ecosystem structure and functioning is impacted. It's fire cycles, hydrology, and the like. Productivity is impacted. As you know, weeds reduce productivity. Your management options are impacted. So this picture is of kogan grass in a pine stand. We were talking earlier about kogan grass and that it burns really hot. If you wanted to burn this stand with the kogan grass in it, probably not a good idea. That's just an example of your management options being compromised. Recreational value is impacted. Then, of course, aesthetics are impacted by invasive plants. The bottom line, though, is that there's tremendous economic costs. It's hard to put a dollar value on these impacts, but to control invasive plants is often $200, $300, $400 an acre. Invasive plants can have tremendous impacts on wildlife. They're reducing the habitat, oftentimes too thick for especially little birds to get through. There's not as much structure. If you have just a monospecific stand, especially of something like kogan grass, a lot of them don't have as much food value. As I mentioned before, your management options can be impacted. And some species are still being used and recommended for wildlife habitat, but we do have a lot of native plants that have evolved with our wildlife species, and it's hard to improve on those. Now, Ted already talked a little bit about control. Herbicides are a big part of the toolbox for controlling invasive plants. There are some mechanical, grazing, burning options as well. Biological options, this is where you introduce a pest to control the species. We don't have too many biological controls in the southeast. The take-home message, though, with invasive plant control is that you have to kill the entire plant. If you don't get the entire root system killed, odds are it's going to sprout back and you're going to have a bigger problem than you started with. Just briefly talk about fire and invasive plants. Usually fire does not help with the control of most invasive plants, especially not using fire alone, because many of them are a fire hazard in and of themselves. Kogan grass, Japanese climbing fern, to name two. Many of them will simply resprout and regrow after a fire. Fire can promote flowering. That's what it does with kogan grass. Promotes seed germination for some of them, and it can actually, with the disturbance, can promote the spread of the invasive plant. But you can use fire, as I mentioned, as part of an integrated approach. Sometimes with kogan grass, running a fire through beforehand to get rid of the thatch allows the new growth to grow, and then you can get better herbicide contact. So it's really important to monitor sites that have been disturbed, food plots, cut over lands, roadsides, stream sides, recently flooded areas, storm damaged areas, internal roads and trails, fire breaks, burned areas, rights of way, and fence rows. So the earlier you can find invasive plant infestations and control them, the better off you are.